So welcome back, everybody. 3 o'clock is always the slump, isn't it, at a conference, on day 2 of the conference. So gird your loins, fill yourselves with energy. I'm delighted to introduce Evgenia Fotiou from the University of Crete. Evgenia is an assistant professor of sociology, though is a cultural anthropologist, and will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions. We've heard a lot about integration in the West, and yesterday we heard about integration in the context of indigenous cultures. What happens when the West meets indigenous? What happens to integration then? Well, Evgenia is going to enlighten us, so thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me? Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Christine, Andy, Leor, Joseph, Mark, everyone that I only knew, most of you virtually until now. I'm having a blast at this conference. We heard some brilliant talks yesterday, some hard acts to follow, hopefully. Thank you for being here, for staying for this afternoon. So as Andy said, I'm going to talk about integration in shamanic tourism. I mean, that's the title of the talk. Towards the end, I'm mostly going to talk about that, but towards the end, I'm going to talk about some other things I've seen in underground groups that take ayahuasca in the United States. So we can see what's happening there. So this is a picture of me more than 20 years ago when I was doing most of this research, when I started studying that intersection of the West with ayahuasca shamanism in Peru. This is where I did, well, and I still go, but not as often anymore. That red pin is where Iquitos is, just in case someone here doesn't know where it is. And I initially spent a couple of years there. Most of my data is from that period of time. And it's still actually really useful. So I started this research in 2002 when ayahuasca, or shamanic tourism, as I like to call it, was still a very new phenomenon. It was actually, it still is in anthropology, actually, not as respected to study tourism. You know, there is a hierarchy of topics in academia, and tourism is kind of down here. It's not, but I thought it was a very interesting space where 2 different worldviews meet. So my interest, I mean, originally I wanted to do something else, to study traditional ayahuasca use, but when I first went to Peru, I decided to study the motives of Westerners who engage with ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru. I was interested in this, in the interculturality that happens in this space. And later I got interested in how the shamanic knowledge is conceptualized, and I'm still working on that. I'll mention some things. The main arguments of this was my doctoral dissertation. My main arguments back then was that tourism, it's not necessarily an anomaly within the shamanic space, in the sense that shamanism has always been this dynamic phenomenon that always liked to appropriate. Shamans always loved to appropriate things from other cultures, right? To integrate them in their practice, because things especially if they're from far away, they're really powerful. So the intercultural exchange in itself is consistent with shamanism. So any critique I've expressed in my work about tourism is not about the exchange itself, that it's happening. The problem is the context, how it's happening, the power inequalities between Westerners and locals. We saw that in the film yesterday in Wetico, right? And how the director of the film approached it. For me, it was really visceral, because I've seen this, I worked on this. So I found in that work that shamanic tourism has some commonalities with pilgrimage, right? If you read literature on pilgrimage, people will go on a pilgrimage, which is a challenging experience, just like an ayahuasca ceremony, for healing and personal transformation. We've heard that from other speakers at this conference as well. And we'll see how this relates to integration, at least what I have seen, right, in this context. So the Western discourse about ayahuasca, in case you haven't heard, right, is medicalizing, meaning that it focuses on healing. This tradition is about many, many other things as well, but Westerners are mainly interested in healing. They go to it for healing. It's also very individualistic. There is this focus on personal transformation. We've also heard it a lot at this conference. There is also, I've published a little bit about how the ways that indigenous peoples are conceptualized and talked about in this space, which are ways that can be problematic. There is this stereotype of the ecological noble savage, that indigenous peoples are closer to nature, or that they are in a way ahistorical because they have been doing these ceremonies for thousands of years. I mean, that's the stereotype. And that they're more spiritual and wiser than us, right? So a lot of people will go to these traditions because of these stereotypes, and because they're looking for solutions, right, to certain problems. One of the problems that people identified, the people I interviewed, was that there is a lack of ritual, especially ritual use of psychedelics in Western cultures. They felt there are no sanctioned, culturally sanctioned spaces for psychedelic use. So they were looking for that, especially with this whole discourse that these rituals are ancient and all of that. So this was a big draw, the ritual, and I'm gonna talk about it today. I'm going to show you some old pictures from my field work, because things have changed a lot. Like I've observed and participated in ceremonies in a few different contexts. The most common context was this kind of situation where you have a building in the jungle outside of Iquitos somewhere, that is very simple. Usually everybody gets a mattress, and people sit around in a sort of circle. Today, most places will have an actual circular building. It has kind of become the standard. It's called the maloca, in case you don't know. But that wasn't the case 20 years ago necessarily. But now it has become kind of the standard. But I've also participated in a lot of ceremonies in Iquitos, in a back room, in a humble house, the house of the shaman or the curandero, where everybody, again, gets a mattress and the bucket. And we also sat around. And this was, again, actually very common, especially for locals, this kind of setting, a back room in a small house in Iquitos. So I mentioned the draw. One of the biggest draws was for Westerners is the ritual. And as Andy said, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and ritual is one of the most interesting things for anthropologists of religion, right? Rituals are important generally in human cultures. They have many purposes. They're usually designed to do something, as I will show today, right? Rituals can mark important milestones in our lives, the so-called rites of passage that were mentioned earlier, that mark milestones like birth, marriage, death, right? And of course, some of the most interesting ones are ones of the rituals that mark the transition from childhood to adulthood in some cultures. Rituals also help individuals connect to a community. We've also heard that in this conference, right? That the importance of community. So rituals are one of the means that this happens. Like participating in the same ritual brings people together, ideally, right? Depending on what the ritual is for, it can help with processing difficult emotions like grief, when at a funeral. Similarly, rituals can provide structure in a situation that can be out of our control, or it does provide a structure in the community and all of that, that are really important to process something like a death, especially. And there are rituals that encourage introspection, especially rituals like ayahuasca rituals in the context of shamanic tourism, right? As we will see. They create the space and the conditions for introspection, and they encourage it. Rites of passage, again, the rituals that mark important transitions in a person's lifetime, have been studied a lot by anthropologists. Van Gennep actually came up with this structure of a rite of passage that you might have seen, that there are three, he argued that there are three phases in a rite of passage. First, there is a separation. So I should add before we get there that a rite of passage is really a rite that marks the change of status for someone, right? If we use the example of someone becoming an adult, right? The rite of passage will mark that transition from childhood to adulthood. So Van Gennep said that there is usually a phase where the individual is separated temporarily from their community, and during that time, they're also separated and removed from their former status. The liminal phase is where a lot of things happen that bring about that change in status of the individual. Or sometimes in some cultures, this was done in cohorts. The liminal phase, you can imagine, is where all the interesting stuff happens. And that's the most interesting part for anthropologists, and we've studied this a lot. And then after all of this interesting stuff happens, there is the phase of incorporation, where the individual is returned to their community with their new status. So if we use the example of someone becoming an adult, then they re-enter their community, their society, with a new socially recognized status. So their community recognizes that now they're an adult, they're expected to behave differently, and they might have more responsibilities. They will be expected to do certain things that maybe they didn't do before, and so on. So these are, I found this model useful when I was looking at ayahuasca rituals, because in a sense, although you will think, okay, how is an ayahuasca ceremony a rite of passage if there is no community to recognize the status, a change of status in the person, in the individual undergoing it. So that part doesn't hold for ayahuasca ceremonies, but I felt that there was this separation for sure. The people traveled physically to go to Peru and participate in these ceremonies, and they did go through this liminal phase together where, like I said, all the interesting stuff happened. And then they did feel, a lot of the times there was, they felt that there was a change, and sometimes they visibly indicated it as well. So maybe the only thing that doesn't hold for this situation is that it's not a socially recognized status, right? Because they go back, in this case, to a society that doesn't, as we've heard from other speakers, doesn't really understand what they were participating in. Another anthropologist, Victor Turner, looked at this liminal phase more extensively and developed Van Gennep's scheme. He was really interested in the liminal phase. What he called liminality is this temporary suspension of ordinary social distinctions and expectations. So he felt that, especially when several people are going through the same ritual, while they are in this liminal state, all the status that we have in society and that affects how people treat us, they are temporarily suspended, right? They're not true. So he felt that everybody has the same status. It's a situation where there is more equality, it's more egalitarian. And he felt that he created this word communitas, that people undergoing a ritual like this might feel. So he defined communitas as the intense community spirit or sense of solidarity that people that undergo the same ritual might experience, this togetherness, and that they feel undergoing this collective liminality. I found that this was true in some situations, especially when there were some groups that maybe, because there was a question before about this, maybe they were not friends before going to these ceremonies, but they became friends over the years by participating in the same in ceremonies together with the same shaman. Like, they would do this every year together. So they did build these bonds and these relationships, and they did feel that, and they all talked about it in the interviews, that they felt this. Well, they didn't call it communitas, obviously, right? This is an ethic category, but they did talk about how they felt close to each other because there were these bonds that were created over the years. I think that's important if we think about what's happening on the ground in Western countries with underground ayahuasca circles. We'll come back to this towards the end. But what about integration? Why am I talking about ritual for the last few minutes? As a reminder, the Psychedelic Society defines integration as integration describes how we can bring insights from a psychedelic experience into our lives at large. This definition implies that you have a psychedelic experience and then you figure out ways to bring it into your life, right? A lot of researchers who have studied altered states of consciousness have pointed out something really interesting, that in those cultures that use altered states of consciousness, especially in sometimes they are used in rites of passage, like with ibogaine in Africa. The altered states themselves, they are embedded within a cycle of meaning, right? That a common ideology that the society shares about these states. And these states do take place within socially prescribed and supervised ritual circumstances. So there is a collective agreement on what these states mean, what they're supposed to do. So, as Fernanda said yesterday, you don't need integration in this situation, right? So this is why I feel a lot of what I observed was very intentionally designed because we don't have this context. We don't have this shared ideology in the West about what this ritual is supposed to do, right? I will give you two examples of what I saw happening in the context of shamanic tourism. The first context is at an indigenous retreat setting where you have an indigenous shaman leading ceremonies. What I've observed in these situations, that a lot of the times there is minimal contact with a curandero or the shaman. Sometimes the participants don't even speak enough Spanish to have a conversation about their experience or anything else, right? So these retreats are generally unstructured. Oftentimes the shaman might go to Iquitos to do their, they have stuff to do, and people stay at the retreat. They have ceremonies 2 or 3 times a week. There is definitely no integration happening, even at a minimal level, because as I said, there is very minimal communication with the curandero. So there is no discussion the day after about what people experience. So this is very common. It also happened in the city of Iquitos, in the back rooms with local shamans. Usually these are mestizo shamans. And in those situations, what would happen is after the ritual was closed, participants would go home, and that was it, right? I mean, you could visit the shaman on another day, but there was not a structure that had any such goal as integration, right? And then we have the Western-led retreats where there was a much more intentional design behind the whole experience. There was what we call a clear framing of the experience, right? The people who run these things, whether in collaboration with the shamans or not, they had a clear idea about what this is supposed to be, and they communicated it very clearly. For example, there was a clear goal or intention setting at the beginning of each ceremony. People would be asked to share what their goal for the ceremony is. The day after the ritual, sometimes even at the end of the ritual, they would ask people to say a few words about how the experience was, but definitely there was a serious discussion the day after about how the experience was for people. They got support from everybody in the group. Sometimes at the end of the retreat, whether it was a week or 10 days, there was another discussion. So there was time allocated for these conversations, which I think were really important because, first of all, when participants vocalized their intention, so my intention is, it's out there in the world. So it's real. So it kind of crystallized it. Even if I think in our minds, we might have a goal going in, I think it kind of makes it it has more gravitas when it's out, when it's verbalized and it's out in the world. So this was very intentional. And then I started looking into how do I talk about this in an academic paper, right? And I started looking into Gregory Bateson's work on framing that was mentioned yesterday. And basically framing is about how communication is shaped by context, right? The same thing might mean very different things depending on the context. And the example that Bateson used was, I think, with 2 monkeys playing, and it might look like an aggressive play. I mean, dogs and cats do this too, right? They might bite and sort of scratch, but Bateson argued that, well, but the frame is that now we're playing. This is play. This is not aggressive. This is not war, right? So he called framing a spatial and temporal bounding of a set of interactive messages. So it's important, basically, to put this simply, is a mental frame that we use to understand the messages we receive. It has this idea of framing has been used in many disciplines, especially communication. And the frame can be influenced by things like culture, our past experiences, like how we interpret things, can be influenced by many things, especially how the information is presented, right? And I think in the context of what I'm talking about, this was very important. How the ayahuasca experience and the ritual itself was presented was very important. I think Erving Goffman's work on frame analysis, basically Goffman took Bateson's work and kind of developed it further. He was more interested in daily interactions between people. He thought that all human experience is mediated through frames. And he was concerned with how we perceive our everyday interactions with others. And basically, according to his words, his notion of the frame was the answer to the question, what is it that is going on here? Like when we look at something like this, what is it? The frame, like the frame is what will tell us what is it that is going on here. Is it a cult? Is it an indigenous ritual? Is it, I don't know, what was the phrase from the movie yesterday? Instagram, shamanism happening. So the frame is important. And there are a few things that I would like to point out. These particular rituals, like I said, this doesn't happen. I didn't see it in all situations, right? But the people who, I will talk about the people who intentionally framed the rituals. Those rituals were transformative by design. They were designed to be transformative, right? They were not, like we often hear that ayahuasca, if you take ayahuasca or other psychedelics, they will transform you. Well, I feel that, and I think Christine's talk put it very, very, very well. These rituals were designed to be transformative. You go in expecting to be transformed, right? So the framing did a few things. First of all, it separated the ritual space as liminal, right? That this is a liminal space. They did this in various ways. I mean, first of all, yeah, there is the circle, and most shamans will say, don't leave the circle unless, you have to go to the bathroom, but don't leave it to go out in the jungle. A lot of these people would ask people to wear white clothing, again, to kind of mark that this is separate, this is special, this is not your everyday life, this is a liminal space where transformation can happen. And the whole way that I described the intention setting and then the sharing, the verbalization, that was also important because it framed the way that participants conceptualized the experience, right? They went in with a goal, right? It wasn't, oh, okay, I'm going to drink this and let's see what happens, right? People were encouraged to set a goal, even if it was something very simple. Like I like what one shaman suggested to people: if you don't have like another goal, you can just set the goal of straightening your energy, meaning their bodily energy, to straighten it, because there are a number of different things in our lives that can mess that up. So he said, if you don't have anything else, just put that as your goal. So that was very, very important. And it was framed through these speeches that were given by the shamans or facilitators, if it was someone who didn't like using the word shaman for themselves. Some people gave speeches at the beginning of the ceremony, giving instructions, but also framing expectations, what to expect, how to handle maybe difficult situations. They gave people a lot of instructions and information. But a very important element, like when I looked at all these transcripts, was that they framed the visionary experience as spiritual and transformative. So people were expecting that they will have a spiritual experience, whether it's seeing Jesus or Buddha or the plant spirits. That was expected, and that there will be some form of transformation that will happen on the other side of this. As I said before, one of the main reasons that people do this is healing, right? So it's important to note that illness in this tradition, and most indigenous traditions, is conceived as having multiple dimensions, right? There's a physical dimension, right? You have certain symptoms in your body, but the same illness can have a psychological dimension, a spiritual dimension. So when you go to a shaman, they might, prescribe they might prescribe some plants for the physical symptoms, but they might also prescribe some things to mitigate maybe any spiritual situation that needs to be addressed, right? So there might be multiple things that they will, or instructions that they will give, right? So there is definitely this idea that we need to address all of that. So in those speeches, and sometimes there were parts within the ritual itself, within the ceremony, that shamans spoke and guided the experience. That was even more interesting. So illness was framed as multidimensional. And what was really interesting that they emphasized grounding in the body, even though a lot of the times people would seek healing for psychological issues. The emphasis was on the body. They encouraged people to focus on bodily sensations, focus on their breath, and if there was an unpleasant sensation in the body, to kind of focus on that and for lack of a better word, integrate it. There was also a focus on personal agency, that it was in their own hands how they would go through this experience and the healing that would happen. And they also emphasized, to be fair, that the work continues upon returning home, right? They were not necessarily saying, okay, you will take ayahuasca this week and then you will go home and be transformed. They were saying, well, there is a lot of work that you need to continue doing after leaving here. So there was a reminding of that. There was also a lot of talk of healing itself as transformation through the management of emotions. Right? There was a focus on the effect of emotions on the body. They emphasized the connection between emotions and the body and what emotions do. And then the idea was that through the ayahuasca ceremony, they would process these things. They would get rid of a lot of things that were causing illness or discomfort. So the framing in this case was about how they were encouraging people to transform negative emotions or experiences or energy into positive ones. It was a discourse of transformation, transmutation kind of situation. And I have a quote here from one of the ceremonies where she I think this was at the beginning of the ceremony, again, preparing people for the cases that they might experience fear or negative emotions. So she said, we become conscious that when we vibrate negatively for a long time, we can harm ourselves or become uncomfortable with ourselves. We can even make ourselves sick. So they really emphasize that negative emotions cause illness, right? That's part of this system. Therefore, by vibrating positively, we help ourselves to transform the negative energy to positive. We are going to celebrate vibrating in a positive way, and our fears, We all have fears, learned fears which are natural. Our fear is energy, which can be transformed into courage. We should breathe deeply and try not to fight the fear, but integrate it. She used the word integrate. So all of this, as I said, happens within the ritual. And I mentioned there is a lot of, in the cases where there is this framing, there is an emphasis on the body, not just by the shamans. So the participants themselves experience this relationship between the body and integrating ayahuasca experiences or getting any benefit out of them. I remember distinctly one woman in one of the ceremonies. So in the last few years, I have been to a few ceremonies in Ohio, in the States. These are obviously word of mouth. It's a small group living in the same geographical area, and they meet maybe a couple of times a year. And again, they have this community that has built around this, where there is a lot of what people describe today, right, about the importance of community. And this was very interesting. This was after a ceremony where every single participant talked about how they experienced, what they experienced in their body during the ritual the night before. And the most striking one was this woman who said that she went to the bathroom, and she felt that she released fear that was trapped in her body. And it was fear from experiences that she had already processed mentally and cognitively. She had forgiven the people that caused the situation. She had processed the experience, but still she felt that there was something in the body that was still there, and then she released it. And she felt free. So why am I mentioning this? I mean, I feel, I put here psychedelic healing in quotation marks, because as others have pointed out, for people in Peru, ayahuasca is not necessarily a psychedelic, but this might be true for other similar substances. I found that healing happens in these type of ceremonies. Healing has two dimensions, even when we're talking about psychological healing. There is the conceptual, the cognitive part that is processed through words, right? There is the shaman might give you instructions to forgive your father for what he did to you, or things like that. But then there is the bodily, the embodied aspect of this, which is nonverbal, and it's experienced very differently from one person to another. But I found that both have to happen. And I think that's why those shamans who use this type of framing are focusing on this connection, right, of the body and healing. And this is a sentence from, I've discussed this in more detail in one of my articles on ritual framing. Basically, I'm saying that by encouraging participants to experience the ritual as embodied mindful persons, the framing in these rituals draws attention to what anthropologists Shepherd, Hughes, and Locke called the mindful body, right, which goes beyond Cartesian dualisms and encourages a more holistic approach to health. Again, all of this is very, I think, is very consciously designed by these healers. So what does framing do? To recap, in this situation, the overall environment and preparation leading up to the ceremony are crucial. Others have pointed it out in this conference. I feel like I'm not really saying anything new. I'm just giving you a more anthropological perspective. So there is a preparation going into this, which is crucial. Then they frame the ceremony as a traditional shamanic healing ritual, which influences people's expectations and, most importantly, the interpretations of their experiences, how they interpret They give them the frame and the tools to interpret their experiences. The ceremony is framed as a transformative space, which can influence, first of all, people come prepared, right? Because transformation is not necessarily easy. So they are prepared that there will be some difficulty, some discomfort. So they come in with this mindset, and also a mindset that is conducive to introspection, right? They are also encouraged to focus within. And they are within this frame, they're more likely to view their visions and emotions, even when they're negative, as useful and healing insights. This is important, how negative experiences are framed, right? There is a lot of purging that happens in ayahuasca ceremonies, and it's framed as something necessary to cleanse energetically of negativity and things that someone doesn't need anymore. And there's a lot of discourse about that. Frightening or disturbing visions are framed as maybe hidden traumas that are resurfacing that require healing. So people are encouraged to kind of sit with that and not necessarily fear it. And generally, negativity is framed as maybe unresolved issues that need further exploration, either in future ceremonies or with a therapist. Of course, I mean, we don't have that much time, but there is a sinister side to this, right? Because I have seen shamans who, as others have mentioned, psychedelics put people in this more susceptible state of mind where they can be manipulated for good or bad, right? So I have seen people being psychologically manipulated and interpreting negativity as maybe some personal failure, that maybe they're not spiritual enough, or they don't really want to heal. And, sometimes those things can be problematic. On top of that, not everything is necessarily a psychological metaphor, right? Westerners tend to interpret some of these experiences as psychological metaphors, my fears, my issues. But the indigenous and the local ideology is very different, right? Sorcery is a big part of this tradition. So some shamans, or at least for most shamans, negative experiences might be interpreted as the result of sorcery or some external agency that might be interfering. So there is that. I mean, I don't know what you might do with this, but it's something to keep in mind, right? Because not everything is a psychological metaphor. And the last major thing I want to talk about is these community circles, right, that we've discussed at this conference. There is a new article that just came out in the States about a small integration group in the southeastern United States, where the anthropologist Lisa Jason observed some of these meetings, interviewed people, and she did a focus group, and she highlighted what everyone has said really pretty much at this conference, right? That there is a need for safe and legal spaces in which people can talk about their experiences. And she argues that medical models of efficacy need to include social and relational elements. I think the most interesting thing about this article, right, on top of what we have been discussing, is she calls this a social efficacy. She proposes that this concept can capture the importance of social relationships to the efficacy of psychedelics, right? It's, as many of you have said at this conference, it's very different when people know each other and there is a common frame, common ideology. to talk about shared ideology, right? To talk about these things. But it goes beyond that. It's not just the immediate, as she says, it's not just the immediate social environment, right? Because these community circles solve that problem, right? They create an immediate social environment in which the psychedelics can be experienced and processed and in these safe spaces. But she also brings attention to the broad range of social relationships, the larger structure that we're all part of, right? The larger political, economic, and historical context that frame psychedelic use, and we still need more work in that direction, right? I mean, we still need to change those Western frameworks about psychedelics. So in conclusion, I talked about the importance, I mean, just like a lot of people at this conference, right? I think we all agree on that, the importance of the wider social context for psychedelic integration. I talked about how intentionally framed rituals help with integration of the visionary and bodily experiences of the participants, and these intentionally framed rituals basically emulate some aspects of indigenous uses, right? Where there is a lack of a common framework, they create it, right? So people can integrate their experiences. And finally, I really think, and based on what everybody has said at this conference, change can only happen from the ground up in these small community circles in all the places like Exeter, right? So thank you for your attention and for being here.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Good to see Zombie Freud making an appearance in the Amazon. We've got about 7 minutes, so time for questions. And I'm going to try and choose people who perhaps we haven't heard so much from.
So can I move now?
So who's running around with the microphone? It's me. I'm going to be challenge Annika.
No, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really nice to listen about your experiences and your fieldwork. I was wondering, when you talk about framing and you mentioned trauma somewhere in between, I wonder if in your fieldwork you were also seeing the so-called trauma-informed sessions, which I think is a bit more popular lately in the last years. And as you said, it can be really beneficial, no? It's this kind of framing. So basically, you go into the experience to discover your traumas, if you have them or not. You have them. That's the point of it. And you might not remember them. So then sometimes you're kind of forced into trying to discover these hidden traumas that you might have, or that you surely have. And this can be beneficial for many people, but it can be quite devastating for some other people also. And then it can also generate memories that may or may not be real. And this is quite a not so much talked about topic in the ayahuasca community, and it is happening. I wonder if you can reflect on it. And then also maybe about if you can just share a word or two on the sorcery, spiritual attack point of the whole thing, because this is something that when I was in Catalonia, that's not really happening.
Right, yeah.
It's kind of, we all know it can be used in that way, but it's kind of set aside. So I would be curious about that, about your opinion.
So yeah, definitely the trauma-informed is a more recent, I didn't see a lot of that. I mean, it's not that often that in these groups you get someone who remembers remember something, a trauma that they were not consciously aware of. like in my field work, there was one such case where someone openly talked about it, and it was hard to watch, really, because the shaman didn't know how. I don't think they handled it really well. There was also this particular situation. I don't know how to talk about this. I feel that there was some psychological manipulation also going on. You said may or may not. So I don't know, but yeah, definitely, because I've seen a lot of the other side of this more sinister side. I'm not, and I'm not a psychologist, so I can't really, I don't feel qualified to talk about some of these things. I mean, you know, that trauma informed, or how someone should handle a situation like that. But I feel there is more of that happening now in retreat centers where they actually have psychologists. Some centers are actually doing that now in light of this, you know, trying to be more, to do the right thing. But also to cater to a Western mentality, right? The psychological framework. In regards to sorcery, what was the question? Oh, yeah. So yeah, if you compare in Peru, people talked a lot about sorcery, like it's an everyday thing. It happens all the time. I've been in ceremonies with Peruvians as participants as well, and they would interpret their experiences very differently. Curiously, in Ohio, that doesn't exist, right? And the facilitator there, right, he doesn't call himself a shaman, says, you know, that stuff doesn't. Actually, they use that as an argument why it's not a good idea to go to Peru because you might be the victim of sorcery. And he says, well, we don't do that stuff here. Here it's just positive light and all of that. So it's really interesting, that discourse as well.
We're nearly out of time, and we're just going to have one, hopefully, very brief question. So maybe
I'll keep it brief. So obviously, this context was Westerners going over and taking ayahuasca and participating in indigenous rituals. Is there any work like looking at the other way around of like indigenous people coming and taking synthetic psychedelics? Or
not that I know of.
In Western rituals? And if anyone has anything on that.
Yeah, I've got a vague answer to that. As does Leo. I can keep it really brief.
Let's give it to Leo.
Very interesting.
No offense, Mark, but we have heard your voice quite a lot.
More like an anecdote, but an anthropologist friend that was in touch with Shipibo for a long time, and he gave them Alad, which was like a research chemical, right? One of the legal highs. So it's a derivative of LSD, and it was the first time they had a Western psychedelic, a synthesized one even. And they had a very biblical, apocalyptic visions coming to them. Yeah. Apocalyptic biblical visions in there once they took the Alad from him. That's an anecdote.
And
very quick follow-up, if I can, Andy. I guess a related question to that is, it's like, so obviously with ayahuasca, it's like linked to the tree spirits and the spirits of the forest. You could say, so where does the spirit of the other psychedelics reside, if anywhere, you know? Or is that a thing?
Very interesting.
Where is Peter when you need him?
Yeah, where is he?
I think one quick question. Oh, all right. Come on then. There goes my timekeeping.
I've got a question. You were talking about rites of passage and how there's not intention setting and integration. And I wonder if that's because it's done within the community. So it's spoken about and it's supported by the family and the community. And then the integration is like, everyone knows what's going on. And I wonder if you think that model could be implemented in Western psychedelic practice, like there could be education around psychedelics so that when people have an experience, they're aware of what's going to happen and they're aware of the work that they need to do afterwards. And I wonder if you think that could be implemented in the West.
Yeah, I think, yeah, basically, if enough people learn about these things and we have a shared framework, then we don't need to go through all the lengths of explaining. Like you said, in the rite of passage in the community, they know what the ritual is supposed to do. You don't have to explain it. And they just do it. They pass on what the knowledge that they need to pass on, but everyone knows what it's supposed to do. So I think I think we are in the process of normalizing these things, right? And eventually, I'm thinking it's going to happen. Right now, it's happening in these small bubbles. So we have the micro, the context at the micro level that is starting to be handled by these community integration circles. But then we need, yeah, once these things maybe get legalized or, but we need, as I said, we need more work to get there, right, as a society.
Okay, well, can we have a round of applause for absolutely fascinating talk? Thank you, Evgenia.